Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on climate change and migration. My name is Piotr Plewa. I'm a visiting research scholar here at Duke University. I'm also a faculty at Stanford School of Public Policy. It is my pleasure to present the two lead authors of World Bank's most recent study on internal migration and climate change. This report we are going to discuss now constitutes the second part of a report that was published in 2018. And the two reports present a quite comprehensive picture of internal migration in the context of climate change. It's also very relevant for us now this week. We will be discussing this report as the COP26 meets in Glasgow. So it's a very timely topic. If you like statistics, the first part of this report was downloaded 111,000 times, and this one was already downloaded 17,000 times since its release on September 13. So we are going to discuss something which I believe is very, very interesting and very important. Thank you very much for joining us. The two lead authors that will present the report to us today are Kanta Rigaud, who is a lead environmental specialist and regional climate change coordinator at the World Bank Group. She has conducted comprehensive research on internal climate migration in West Africa and in the Lake Victoria Basin. The second guest is Viviane. Viviane Clement, who also works in the World Bank Group as a senior climate change specialist. So without further delaying, I would like to invite you to present and tell us a little bit more about the report that you have co-authored. Just on the organizational aspect, we will present the report for around 20-25 minutes, however much time you need for it, and then we'll move to the questions and answers. To the audience, you will be able to submit your questions anytime from now on using the question and the question window in the Zoom. And when we finish, I will be presenting the questions that you posed to the speakers. If possible, please limit your question to a question, and hopefully we will be able to answer most of the questions that you pose. Thank you very much, and Viviane and Kanta, please join us.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for the introduction and really for the opportunity to share with you the findings of the Groundswell reports, particularly with the focus on the latest Groundswell report. So as you've mentioned, we at the World Bank have done this work on the Groundswell looking at internal climate migration. We started this work a few years ago when we launched the first report, and about just over a month ago, we launched the part 2 of the report. What I think would be very useful is to allow us to a few minutes to set the stage and to provide you a sense of what were the big picture results, and then dive into the detailed analysis with a focus on the new regions, and then looking at what is it that we can do in terms of action. Now, when we started this report, we focused on internal climate migration, and that is really movement of people as a consequence of climate change within their countries. And we were often asked the question, why did we focus on internal and not cross-border or international? For a couple of reasons. The first being that, 3 out of 4 people actually move within their countries. And the second is from a development perspective, the World Bank being a premier development institution, we were very interested to understand what is it that we could do at the nexus of climate, migration, and development. The second aspect is that we focus on the slow onset climate change. This is looking at how 3 critical slow onsets in terms of water availability, which sometimes translates into water stress, drops in crop productivity, and sea level rise compounded by storm surge, which can reduce the habitability and livability on those areas, could really influence and pile on to the internal climate migration context. And the third is that we looked at a time duration of up to 2050. This is medium term enough to allow for planning and to kind of bring about the critical transitions as we look to manage this issue better. Now, when we look at this work, we really try to answer some very specific questions using the model-based approach that I will share with you in a minute. So really unpacking what we mean by internal climate migration, we were interested to say exactly what would be that scale of movement of people under future climate scenarios, and more than the number, try to understand if there were localities that would emerge as hotspots. And to further to that, to what extent was the potency of climate to drive mobility under the future scenarios, implications for planning, so that we really wanted to use this kind of model-based approach and scenario-based approach to better inform policymakers to both plan and prepare for the kind of mobility that would happen. And this is really building on the fact that we do see an emergence of this issue in the current day. There is not a day that goes by in the media when we don't hear people who are displaced. And we know that IDMC, which records the numbers year to year, those numbers have been going up, and 3/4 of those can be attributed to hydrometeorological events and climate factors. Mm-hmm. So a little bit about the modeling approach that we use. And when we set this up 3 years ago, it was really very painstakingly done with a whole set of researchers. We worked with geographers from the Earth Institute in Columbia University. We worked with demographers from the CUNY Institute of Demographic Research and climate scientists from the Potsdam Institute. And we decided to take a scenario-based approach to look at the plausible scenarios and the ways in which climate-induced migration within countries could play out. As a starting point, we started with what we call the pessimistic reference scenario. This really brings together the sort of context of high emissions, that is, if we don't curtail our emissions and continue business as usual, and often is likened to in the IPCC lingo as the RCP 8.5, and then couple this with unequal development, which we often see in many of our client countries at the World Bank. And to that, we looked at an alternative scenario, which was an inclusive development scenario, where we kept the emissions high and brought in the moderate development, and then the more climate-friendly scenario, which is really reducing the emissions down to the context of like the Paris Agreement in terms of RCP 2.6, and yet pursuing unequal development. This kind of scenario-based approach allowed us to understand the sort of trade-offs and the sensitivity to the different elements of the scenario. And what did we do at the modeling level? We brought in together the composite of climate, demographic, and the climate impact models and ran this at a 14-kilometer grid cell. And when I say here the climate impact models, we really look at crop and water simulation models that would sort of give you the sense of productivity losses or gains, as well as the water stress, based on the ISIMIT models that the scientists have developed. So it goes beyond the sort of generic temperature and precipitation exposure models. And these were then modeled down to 14-kilometer grid cells, and then aggregated upwards to get the national figures. Now, what happens in this model is that we are inputting the climate parameters, and we were then able to compare it with the counterfactual where there aren't, and there is sort of the regular demographic movement, to then really distill out what is this sort of potency for climate to drive this kind of spatial shifts between climate impact scenarios and no climate impact scenarios. Those 14-kilometer grid cells, as I mentioned, are aggregated up to the national level and then aggregated to the regional level, which is also the level at which some of the results have been presented. But I think it's important to understand here that it's really derived at that grid level upwards. And since we developed this model for the Groundswell I and Part 2, to the work that Piotr mentioned on West Africa and in Lake Victoria Basin, we have expanded this model to bring in additional parameters into the modeling. We've added a fourth scenario called the optimistic scenario. We've added additional layers to bring in drops not just in crop productivity, but changes in ecosystem productivity, which is especially important for livestock communities. We brought in the impacts of flood risk in the future, and then also layered in data on the conflict side, drawing from the armed conflict location data. So where do a quick picture on sort of the big picture results, but I think even as we go into the results, we just want to remind people that, obviously there's a push and pull when it comes to migration and mobility. And there are many factors that do drive that movement. Economic, social, we know that political have been becoming quite important, and environmental degradation that continues. But what we have come to do through these results is to indicate that the potency for climate to drive migration is growing. And these were the results that we got aggregated upwards now for the 6 regions that we have completed through the Part 1 and Part 2 report. So what we are having here, the 216 million people, is for the pessimistic scenario at the high end, saying that by 2050, if we don't take concrete climate and development action, we could have a scale of as many as 216 million people across the 6 regions that we have worked on. And by far, it's the poor and who are disproportionately impacted in the most vulnerable areas. So we see here that sub-Saharan Africa could have as many as 86 million on the high end, followed by East Asia, but also in South Asia, 40 million, largely driven by the vulnerabilities in low-lying areas of Bangladesh. But while we give you these numbers, we also would like to indicate that sometimes the numbers do not tell the whole story. So while the percentage of mobility in overall is about 3% of the global population in 2050 and about 3.5% in sub-Saharan Africa, in North Africa, where it's 19 million, it's really going to be representing almost 9 to 10% of the population at that time. So really the movement of people is really a composite of climate factors acting with the demographic and the local context within the countries. But overarchingly, it is the poorest and the most vulnerable areas that will be hit, but no region or country will be totally immune. So besides the numbers, we looked at the trajectory. What would be that trajectory of movement between now and 2050? And there is a path dependency built into the system. And so this is why the comparison across the scenarios allows us to see how persistence of the more climate-friendly scenario could reduce the numbers and the scale of mobility quite distinctly. And this is true as a pattern and trend across the 3 sub-regions that we model within the larger region. But even in that context, when you compare these 3 sub-regions, we see that in Lower Mekong, that scale could improve, could multiply by 6% from 2020 at the highest scenario, and followed by North Africa with a 4-fold increase, in Central Asia with a 2-fold. I think all of this really affirms 2 things. One is the potency for climate to drive the mobility, but 2, the locality and the characteristics of the locality in terms of how climate development and other factors come into play become really important. And so when we are actually devising strategies to respond, we must take that into account. In comparing the 3 scenarios, then, as you saw from the trajectory, we can also take a shot of it at the 2050. And there's a consistent message that comes across on how important it is to reduce the emissions and to pursue more moderate development pathways, because in all cases almost, they do bring about a reduction in the number of potential climate migrants. And this could be as high as 80% in the best case if we do pursue those kind of climate-friendly and more inclusive development. With that, let me pass it on to Viviane to go a little bit into the deep dives of the regions that we have just focused on in the second part of our report. So over to you, Viviane, for part 2.
Thanks a lot, Kanta.
Thank you, Kanta.
Thank you.
Exactly. So what I'll do here in this section is exactly as Kanta said, go into a little bit of a deep dive geographically into the subregions that we did a focus in the context of the second report, and into some of the country case studies. So for your information, the sub-regions of focus that we looked at in particular were North Africa, the lower Mekong countries, as well as Central Asia. And there were corresponding case studies, country case studies for each in the context of Morocco, Vietnam, and the Kyrgyz Republic. And then we'll move into some of the key takeaways for the report. But in terms of the geographic hotspots. So I want to emphasize here something that Kanta said around the message that locality matters critically. And one of the key results that we present in the report is around these climate in-migration and out-migration hotspots. And we find that these hotspots are set to intensify in rural and urban and coastal systems. And we find that they emerge as early as 2030, and then they spread and intensify by 2050. And that, of course, the implications for rural and urban areas are going to be very different. You see the example before you here of the North Africa hotspots. And you can see that intensification happening between the 2030 map that is up top and the 2050 map that is at the bottom. In general, across the regions, climate out migration hotspots denote areas that are going to be affected by the impacts of sea level rise, increasing water scarcity, decreasing productivity. And in the case of North Africa, the emphasis is really on water scarcity as this important driver of potential internal climate migration. And of course, in the context of the low-lying Nile Delta, the impacts related to sea level rise. But how the combination of these factors are going to play out at the country level are going to be differentiated. So let me give you a couple of examples here from Morocco and Vietnam after that. So in the case of Morocco, in terms of key livelihood systems, especially in terms of rural areas and agricultural areas, we know that rain-fed croplands and pastoral and rangelands are prevalent. We also know that there is a concentration of people and a growing concentration of people in coastal areas and in particular urban centers. And so what our migration hotspot patterns denote that we find in the report really emphasizes the story around water scarcity, and that water scarcity really emerges as a key driver of potential internal climate migration in the context of Morocco. It would drive people away from inland areas. You can see, for example, on the hotspot maps, the Central Atlas foothills that would be affected by increasing water scarcity, and drive movement towards these coastal urban centers. So places like Rabat and Tangiers and the Tingitana Peninsula in general. Something to note for Morocco and North Africa in general is that relative to other regions, the proportion of potential internal climate migrants is higher relative to total population than some of the other regions that we looked at. And this really denotes the role of climate change impacts and water scarcity in particular in driving that potential movement. And so what we do in the context of the country case studies is to try to see, well, what are some of key policy areas and action areas of focus? And in the case of Morocco, things like implementing long-term strategies to manage water resources, adapting sensitive sectors to climate change, in particular agriculture, which remains an important economic sector, including for employment. But at the same time, pursuing these economic transitions around low carbon and resilient trajectories. Morocco, of course, already taking action on many of these areas in both the near, medium, and long term. To give you a slightly different example of how these different factors play out, I'll just talk through the example of Vietnam very briefly. So in the case of Vietnam, the story is different, right? It's when we're looking at especially the lower Mekong Delta and the lower lying areas of Vietnam, where the impacts of 1 and 2 meters sea level rise are really going to be felt, particularly in this lower Mekong Delta region, and for the key livelihood systems that are hosted there, whether it's rice culture, fisheries, some urban centers located there, et cetera. And so what we find in terms of the hotspot patterns for Vietnam is that it's not just the impacts of sea level rise that are going to play out here in terms of the outmigration hotspots, but those impacts are going to combine, at least is the case for the lower Mekong Delta, with projected decreases in water availability and declines in crop productivity as well. And what this could do is then drive movement into also coastal urban centers. So you see the hotspots, in-migration hotspots denoted there in red on the map on the central coast, but also around the capital, Hanoi. One important thing to remember is that these coastal centers, or these urban centers rather, are already themselves exposed to extreme events such as flooding and cyclones. And so important to take into consideration here the role of compounding impacts, right, between sudden onset events and the slow onset events in the context of planning. An important thing to note for the context of Vietnam is that even in climate outmigration hotspots, so this includes, Ho Chi Minh City, for example, and the lower Mekong Delta that we just talked through, these are going to continue to support large numbers of people. And so what does that mean in terms of planning between in-migration and out-migration hotspots and differentiated needs? And so here, looking at what potential, actions could be, we emphasize here the promoting regional development that, for example, creates new livelihoods in rural areas, but also this importance of embedding climate resilience in urban planning, with Vietnam taking action on these fronts as well. So I hope this gives you a bit of a snapshot for the types of regional and country level results that we present in the report. I wanted to touch on briefly on two additional chapters that we have on the report, run around the Middle East, the Mashrek countries in particular, and the small island developing states, where here too, climate is playing an increasing role in terms of mobility patterns. We don't model these areas specifically because the methodology could not be readily applied, but we do cover them in a qualitative narrative where we try to examine what are environmental and climate related mobility patterns and trends drawing from the literature. So in the context of the Mashrek countries, we emphasize, for example, how the role of water scarcity, heat stress in particular, and natural resource degradation could increasingly act as push factors for migration in these countries, in addition to other compounding shocks. And the context of small island developing states, which are of course very diverse, but in the context of the Pacific Islands in particular, how sea level rise is contributing to the shrinkage of available land area, and how this combination with extreme weather events and deteriorating livelihood systems could raise questions about long-term habitability. SIDS are, of course, having this proactive role in regional and global dialogues around integrating climate resilience and mobility into different policy frameworks. And so we try to highlight some of these as well in the report. So now let us, maybe conclude here with some of the key takeaways from the report that we put forward. What we emphasize in the context of the report is that this window to act on internal climate migration is still open, but that the window is not going to be open for very long. And so action is needed now in 4 key areas at this intersection of climate, migration, and development. So these are some of our 4 key takeaways. The first is really, a global message around cutting global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really to reduce the climate pressures that drive a potential internal climate migration, and particularly that drive the conditions that could lead people to move under conditions of distress. Our second message is that, beyond the cutting of emissions, which is of course an imperative, that it is equally important to integrate climate migration into far-sighted, green, resilient, and inclusive development planning. So this means thinking about the issue not just for the near term, but also into the medium and long term, building systems that are resilient, for example, so that people have the opportunity to move away from areas of risk and to areas with better conditions. Our third message is that we really, is to really sort of plan for each phase of migration. So before, during, and after. And this is to ensure that migration as an adaptation solution or strategy can result in positive development outcomes. And we try to draw that out in the report, that it has to be well managed, planned, and prepared for migration to be a positive adaptation strategy. And finally, we have a fourth message around continuing that investment in understanding the drivers and their nuances around climate migration. So this is through more evidence-based research, modeling, consultations to inform policy responses that are tailored, but also having that approach that comes from the bottom up. So now let me pass it to Kanta to give you a little bit more information on the MAX framework. Over to you, Kanta.
Thank you, Viviane. And, I think what's really important for this issue that we know is going to sort of increase and amplify under changing climate. And of course, we want to take action that would reduce the scale of at least, distress-driven migration. So to unpack further, I think the 4 high-level policy messages, we built out some of this from the work that we've been doing in West and East Africa. And because those studies were based on sort of more granular analysis done at a sort of down to a 1 kilometer grid cell and with additional factors, again, reaffirming the potency for climate to drive migration, we wanted to take those policy recommendations down a notch to really begin to inform policymakers and decision makers in terms of what do we do. So the point of the center area you can see is the 4 high-level policy messaging. But if we begin to unpack that to try to come up with a framework of response for countries in discussion in the consultations and to other conversations, there were really 5 elements that arrived that decision makers and planners could look at. The first was clearly, to Viviane's point, I mean, we're not, this is a model-based approach, and there have been other sort of means in which people are looking at the issue. Mostly, I think, in terms of the current crisis context, but clearly the pattern of climate impacting that mobility is increasing. So we do believe that we need to continue to invest in this spatio-temporal analytics with a more of a bottom-up engagement from communities, understanding what are the sort of immediate drivers that are causing that kind of displacement, and to build that into the analytics at large. But in terms of adopting far-sighted strategies, one is about, as you can see from the analysis that we've been presented, we have to be mindful that these hotspots are going to emerge over time and space, and that we need to begin to look at the bigger picture and begin to plan. So when you have coastal areas that will be particularly at risk and need to recede or need to have some kind of planned relocation, we also need to take more territorial approaches and landscape approaches that really factor this potency of movement. But clearly the first course of action is how do you help them to adapt in place, but then there will be some level of mobility that would have to be done, and to bring in sort of more resilient and green inclusive development. But while we say adaptation is an adaptation strategy, and it should be, there are also ways in which we can go beyond that to really harness this climate migration for jobs and economic transitions. In many of the countries that we look at, particularly in the case of sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Asia, these countries are going to see a continued increase in populations, and they're going to see an increase in the youth bulge that is going to come out, and trying to sort of sustain livelihoods and populations in some of the climate sensitive sectors may not be totally viable. I think while some of those can be strengthened, there's also a need to think about how to transition into climate smart opportunities and sort of transitioning even in the urban context to create those kind of climate smart jobs and drive the economic and harness the economic and demographic dividends in a positive way. And the third is really, recognizing that this is an area where we talk of crisis today, and there's always a humanitarian response or a response by the disaster risk community when there is an extreme event. And in a way, the responses have been sort of emergency responses and sometimes very targeted to a particular driver or distress signal. And there is really a call here to us and the development community, the humanitarian, and even the security communities on sort of coming together and working end-to-end solutions so that we really see a seamless connection between the different partners' interventions, of course, working with local and national actors. Otherwise, we continue to have a fragmented response, and this is not really sustainable or to the best interest of the communities who are impacted. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the sort of the legal context. We know that migration is a cross-cutting issue, and oftentimes within a national context, there isn't really a natural partner on this except for the disaster response agencies. But countries are beginning, to be more aware of it. There is the internal displacement guidance, but there's also the Global Compact for Migration, which asks for looking at some of these underlying causes. In the regional context, for example, in Africa, we have the Kampala Convention that actually recognizes the need for states to support some of the people who have been displaced by climate issues. But there is a need to domesticate some of these provisions, legal processes and agreements, and make them sort of more coherent and cohesive towards a better outcome for those communities who are most impacted. So really what we want to propose here is that some of these analytics we have done and looking at the fact that some of these hotspots could emerge as early as 2030, it's important to take that big picture view and to embed these processes into the national development planning context and policy dialogue. So let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Kanta. Viviane, did you want to add something?
No, only to say that we're just trying to provide some of the key links to the reports, both the Groundswell reports and the Africa Groundswell reports that Kanta mentioned, as well as some of the other products around the reports, all here in this slide. So over to you, Piotr. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. It really presents a lot of useful information for policymakers, but also for academics. You talked about how you were doing this research, and this is fascinating because you undertook a very challenging task of predicting the future. And maybe with that, we can just start with a general question. What were the biggest challenges that you faced when planning, implementing and analyzing this research?
Maybe I can start off. I think when we did the first report, I think what we found when we wanted to look at this issue, and we were trying to sort of not shift, but expand the focus from current crisis to anticipating how this issue would unfold. We knew a few things were given. We knew that climate change was happening. We knew that climate change was amplifying the impacts on communities. And you see that both in sort of peer-reviewed literature, you see that in evidence coming up. But trying to make the link in terms of what it meant for migration, recognizing that climate is often perceived as a threat multiplier and not the single factor that drives mobility. So coming up with a methodology that was able to use consistent, globally available best data sets was really important, and bringing the best minds to bear on it. So developing the methodology and the approach really took a lot of painstaking discussion, and also to add a level of transparency and consistency to the assumptions that were made, so that we're not sort of saying that this is the only way to do it, but we tried to sort of distill out the potency for climate in terms of spatial population shifts that could be coming up as a consequence of climate change. That required a lot of consultations. We brought together experts and had workshops with them twice to validate the methodology, to look at the assumptions. I think that work really, we were thankful to all of the researchers and academics who really participated and added their value contribution, because that foundation was very important. But there were times when you have to look at it in many different ways. We thought we could start looking at it from ecological region perspective, looking at arid landscapes and tropical ecosystems, but there wasn't sufficient literature to sort of dive deeper down. And we felt that that was better based on the case studies and agent-based studies that we could draw from, but it couldn't land itself as a model that could cut across to give us an aggregated scale of the issue that globally as a community, we could sort of, say that these are some of the potential of mobility that we need to be mindful of and we need to prepare for, not making a normative judgment of whether it's good or bad, but that we don't want distress-driven migration that could roll back development gains. Long answer to your short question, but I just wanted to put that in context.
Right, thank you so much. There's one question about the conflict. So, as you know, these flows happen in both in the context of context and environmental factors, often both of them combining together. The question that I see here is, does this report say anything about the role of predicted climate migration in new or existing conflicts in the regions you have looked at?
Viviane, I'll take that. In terms of conflicts, I think in reviewing the literature, right, I think that initially when one looked at the literature, even back 3 to 5 years ago, there was a lot of hesitancy in concluding any direct link between conflict and climate change. I mean, and not that we have reached this conclusion now, but there is this meta-analysis that have been done by Burke et al., which begin to show that oftentimes the underlying factors that could be leading to conflict could be driven by environmental resource degradation, which itself is being amplified in some cases by climate change. So I think it's still, the body of work is still coming out. But in the work that we did for East and West Africa, what we did do was we didn't model a conflict per se, but what we did was we brought in the ACLED data, which is spatial in a way. And since our model is spatial, we did what you call a spatial criggling. This is a technical term that our demographers, basically looking at where there is high mortality with another locality and coming up with a surface that modulates between the two, so you can see where the hotspots of conflict are, and then how that really interacts with the climate model. And what we did find is a weak signal for now, but the fact is that the signal was weaker, I would say, in the rural areas, in the sense that the conflict sent people towards urban areas. Now you could rationalize and say why that is, because maybe they feel less exposed. That's the interpretive layer. But in terms of the model, it showed that there was a movement towards urban areas away from rural areas. Now this really has implications on some of the spatial hotspots that we look at. But since the signal was not so strong in some cases, I think it's something that we think needs to be validated further with ground data, on-the-ground data, and discussions.
Great, and maybe to add, I don't know if the person who asked this has seen the internal monitoring displacement ID. Let me get the internal monitoring displacement. Internal Displacement Monitoring Center reports. And these reports show the data of the new displacements, both in the context of climate change as well as conflict. And in 2020, it was reported that there were 3 times as many displaced in the context of climate change. So it's also a very interesting resource to look at when it comes to the conflict. The second question that I see here is refers to probably to your first publication, because it asks about the Central American region. What are the estimates of internal migration within the Central American region who are already facing impact due to the dry corridor, especially in the Northern Triangle?
Viviane, do you want me to take that, or you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can start on that one for the broader and kind of remind everyone of the hotspots, and then pass it to you, Kanta, if that's okay. But yes, so for Latin America region, as a whole, the scale was, if I remember correctly, 17 million potential internal climate migrants by the 2050 timeframe. And we did look at Mexico and Central America as one of the subregions of focus in that first report. And what we found in terms of the hotspot patterns, so the spatial patterns of climate in and out migration, was that what climate impacts related to in particular water scarcity would do is to amplify some of the existing rural to urban migration trends that the subregion is already seeing. So migration out of some of the coastal areas that would face increasing water scarcity, driving movement into highland areas, which are often hosting urban centers. So, of course, the region already being well underway in terms of that rural to urban sort of transition. But in this case, we were really seeing climate impacts, slow onset climate impacts, adding on top of that to amplify that trend further. And so, one of our key takeaways in the context of that analysis was to say, well, a certain number of the countries in the LAC region, already sort of middle, high income economies. And so, perhaps have that additional adaptive capacity to be able to target resources towards the issue. But at the same time, very important to pay attention to pockets of poverty in this particular context, both in the areas that could be sending potential internal climate migrants and in receiving areas to ensure social cohesion. But yes, go ahead, Kanta, if you wanted to add on that.
Okay, great. Another question is what specific aspects of climate change were important in your analysis? Is it CO2 emissions, water level rising, temperature changes?
I think generally the coefficient that is the highest is the water issue. Mm-hmm. And, obviously because, crops also relate to the water, but the water coefficient. So what we did in sort of modeling is for these coefficients that we derived, we basically did a backcast model from 1990 to 2000 to 2010 to get a sense of what the signal was, the climate signal for that coefficient, which is then factored into the algorithm. And water availability or water stress, I think, emerges as the most important factor. I might add here that, this is done based on those 20-year backcasting and validation. And as we speak, the climate signal is getting stronger, right? So it's interesting to think that if you had another 10 years of data, what would that mean? Because those signals will be stronger. But we were able already to pull up those water signals, and water was particularly the important one for the model. Then in terms of coastal areas, the sea level rise compounded by the storm surge, because that's a mask that we filter in, so it's sort of identifying areas that will lose their habitability. So clearly when you have coastal countries, particularly low-lying countries, then that factor becomes particularly important. So the example that Viviane was talking about, when there is the convergence of that low-lying area like in Mekong, compounded with the fact that there is a water stress in the lower Mekong and drops in productivity, you see that hotspot in the lower Mekong being particularly potent. So it's really important to look not just at the one most potent factor, but the amplification, especially when these factors converge.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question about about whether you have taken into consideration the community voices, or is it more the dialogue with the states?
To you, Viviane.
Yes, thanks. So there, I guess, two parts to this question. One is in the methodology itself. As Kanta mentioned before, we're trying to do, a scenario-based approach out to 2050, and, looking at these three climate impact factors in particular, and doing it at a level where, we can draw out, spatial patterns, use, globally available data sets that can be downscaled, et cetera. So the analysis itself and the modeling itself is being undertaken at a certain level. Of course, in the sub-regional deep dives and the country deep dives that we do, we try to, as much as possible, and this is, going back to Kanta's point about how the combination of different factors, whether these are social factors or demographic factors or economic factors, are going to combine in the context of a given country and in the context of a given locality to have different development implications. And this is where we do two things in the context of the case studies, which is to try to bring in what is the latest literature covering these different aspects to be better able to contextualize the results within the country environment. What we also did was undertake consultations in the context of the country case studies, where we invited various stakeholders, so civil society and academia and our government counterparts as well, to reflect on and react to the results, to be able to ground truth them to a certain extent, if you wish. And so we do summarize that in the context of the report. So we thought that both those aspects were particularly important in the context of our country case studies. And of course, as Kanta mentioned, as the work gets taken forward, as the work gets, downscaled, layers of environmental factors, social factors, and demographic factors get, added to the methodology. And this is also where there is that additional opportunity to have those additional bottom-up approaches and to get those additional perspectives, especially when we're talking about tailored solutions for the local context. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. And you have mentioned the need for true collaboration on the issue. And here, Gabriel Spilker asked a question about that relates to the cooperation. How do you see the role of international actors such as the World Bank or other donors, but also implementing agencies in this context? When, or rather until when, should they invest in adapting in situ? And when should such organizations rather start to finance migration as an adaptation strategy in order to avoid help creating trapped populations?
Yeah, this is a very important question, and I think this is where the rubber hits the road, and you have to make decisions. And one thing I might say here is that in some of the work that we've taken in East Africa, Kenya being one of the countries. So right now, the World Bank just approved a project last week, actually, called Financing Locally Led Climate Action. So this is in Kenya, which is a country that has decentralized, issues to the 47 counties. And this particular program, that's $150 million, is going to work with those counties to strengthen their capacities, strengthen their basis of assessing the climate impacts, and also create what we call a climate change fund within the counties to access what we hope will be the billions of dollars coming from the Glasgow Agreement, so to speak. But nevertheless, the important part is the analytics. And we're bringing the analysis that we've done on these hotspots and the climate migration, and recognize, although we are looking at climate migration, the analysis also highlights climate impacts in general. So we're bringing this geospatial analysis into the conversation with the counties to make and have exactly those discussions, right? There are some localities, particularly in the coastal areas, which are more time sensitive and where we have a certain window of opportunity to strengthen the coastal green or gray infrastructure and livelihoods. So we're also actually working with the Kenya Marine Fisheries Project, which we work on the coast. So between the Kenya Marine Fisheries and this county project, which looks a lot at the arid and semi-arid lands, we want to factor in this data into those decision-making process in terms of what is it that we can do near term, and what we must do near term in terms of building resilience, which is green and clean and inclusive. Where is it that certain hard decisions have to be made in terms of mobility? And so I think it's factoring in. We have one good project. Another example is Sao Tome and Principe, which we were able to use. This is before the Groundswell study. They were able to use 3 sources of data to convince communities that they needed to move away from the coastline. They were able to have the data that showed how the sea had come in. Number 2, they were able to use the satellite data to reconstruct how much of the coastline they had lost over the past years and project losses over the coming years. to convince the communities that they needed to relocate, and then work with the communities and the government to set up, their new relocation settlements behind the current areas. And it was done in a very inclusive manner, I might add, Piotr, where we really understood what the needs were of the community, what their aspiration. You're talking of communities who have always lived by the sea and could not fathom the thought of not seeing the sea in the morning, or feeling that they had connectivity to that, and how the system was arranged where there could be buses that would bring people to sort of, have this kind of ability to connect with the coastal areas. So I think that's one of the projects that has really looked at using the best data, the science, and a bottom-up approach to look at this relocation when it was needed.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of relocation, I'm just wondering, I myself have spent some time in the Maldives studying migration there, but of course the climate change was even a bigger issue than migration then. And in the Maldives, the government was building islands, was investing in artificial islands, adding sand, adding construction. Actually, this all was possible thanks to migrants. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. How can we ensure the sustainability of this type of approach? I would think that the sea continues to erode land, even if we build certain infrastructure. How long can we expect it to last, and how long can we expect to have funding for this type of solutions?
That's a very interesting example you raise. I think it's one that it's hard to make a judgment on it, whether it's good or bad. But I think what Maldives, the little that I know about it, I mean, they've really worked to raise the elevation because they are so low lying. And the other strategy they have used is consolidating people away from the atolls that are even more low lying, and to bring them together. I think these are some of the challenges and struggles of the small island states, thinking at multiple levels on the strategies, right? And some of these strategies, it's hard to know what sustainability it has, but I think they are looking at the near term versus the longer term, where they feel that they need to come up with solutions. So it's really an important part of the discussion that's happening in Glasgow and keeping warming to below 1.5, I guess. I think it's thinking outside the box is what I would call it at best, right?
Can you think of any financing best practices that have emerged already?
Viviane, you want to take this? I'm happy to go on.
Yeah, maybe to sort of broaden it back to the the question that came before about the role of the bank, and where can development partners, et cetera, intervene, and where and when. But I guess the way we were thinking about some of the key takeaways of the report is, and I would really emphasize here, is that I think there's a role for the bank and development partners. Again, we emphasize across these three phases of the migration cycle, right? And this is, in terms of support for policy reform, it's in terms of, investments on the ground, like Kanta just mentioned, in terms of, expanding the knowledge base and the data, et cetera. So, when we're talking about those three phases, and we say, for example, what does it mean in terms of investment, before moving? So things that have been brought up during the conversation, right? So what does it mean to invest in viable livelihoods so that people can stay in place where that is possible? So here we're talking about, nature-based solutions, whether, and the role that it has in resilience building for, coastal areas, rural areas, and, urban solutions as well. When we're talking about climate smart agriculture and how that is different in terms of, arid versus not landscapes. But then also when we're thinking about, what support can be given, during movement or to facilitate mobility. Our colleagues are doing a lot of work around human capital and human development. So, what does it mean to have social protection systems that are flexible, that are adaptable, that are portable? How to ensure that migrants in both the sending and receiving areas have access to public services and health services that are comprehensive and available. And then when we're talking about after movement, what are the differentiated needs between sending and receiving areas? We touched on social cohesion during the discussion, but I would just like to bring back here the importance of urban centers, right? As areas that would be receiving additional numbers of people, not just because of the patterns that we see in the report, but also global urban trends. One thing to emphasize is that the urban areas in the context of the report play a very important role, right? Both as in migration hotspots and out migration hotspots. So, how can cities act as areas for innovation, as momentum towards the next generation of green jobs, resilient solutions across different sectors, whether we're talking about energy or transport. So there's a whole body of work that can be done, in that domain, and where there's a role for development institutions to take action.
Wonderful. Well, we will see more news after this week. It's a crucial moment. You mentioned your methodology, and here is a question about how could this research be further improved? What information did you wish you had and could not get at the time that you were doing research?
I think one area that we really believe that needs to be done is really understanding still. I mean, we know what general motivations are that communities move, right? And I think the agent-based model, which really works much more bottom up, we do think that complementing that with some of these emerging hotspots will be really important. So this is where we're trying to go next, where we say, look, where they, and in fact, some of this is being done by other partners as well, where we can see either hotspots of current mobility based on IDMC's data that you were talking about, or where we are going to be seeing emergent hotspots. We'd like to sort of understand, what is happening now and what are some of those adaptation deficits or development deficits that one can sort of address and be more proactive about and bring that into your far-sighted solutions. Because I think that cannot be replaced by models. I think it needs that sort of getting into the trenches and understanding what is it that is at play. So that's one area that we do believe that there's a lot of scope to work with researchers, with universities, depending on your locality of country of interest. And we would be very keen to hear from you and your research team if there are such areas that you're working on. We've been approached by different outfits to look at specific hotspots, and we think that's a great idea. And there is some emerging methodologies that are coming out. We know that the social colleagues of ours have developed what they call the Social Sustainability Inclusion Index, which really has three parts to it. One is about inclusion, the second is around social cohesion and resilience, and the third is about empowerment. And they used various data to develop these indices. In fact, they did it for some work in Mexico. And it's a nice overlay, and we also did it in Cameroon. And what it revealed was they had certain hotspots of fragility and vulnerabilities. And when we compared that with the hotspots that we had on the migration, they were very resonant. And this really tells you about these pre-existing vulnerabilities, which are really going to be amplified by climate impacts. And therefore, when we addressing solutions, we need to get to those adaptive capacities, like Viviane said, investment in human capital, diversification of livelihoods. So, but that can only be done with that sort of bottom-up research, and that's what we're trying to venture towards in a demand-driven way, and we are getting some demand. So that's probably a good way to say where our next steps might lie.
Great. So maybe to end on a positive side, we often hear about climate migration as something that is portrayed as maybe not negative, but something that is definitely not positive. In your research, in your conversations with communities, with migrants, have you heard anything positive about what is the positive aspect of climate migration? I guess apart from remittances, because if someone is forced to move and they move to a place where they have a job as opposed to not having a job, they can send remittances. So this is one probably the big positive aspect. Anything else that you may have overheard?
I heard one recent example of a project at the bank that really heartened me. And like you said, overall, I do think that we need to look at it in terms of jobs, economic transition, and green growth. I think that's where we are looking at in the context of the bank. But a specific project in Nigeria was very interesting, where you have this youth who were migrating, obviously from rural to urban areas. And there was then a project that brought in solar energy into their neighborhoods. And that solar panels were then able to invigorate a factory where they do some local production of local food. I can't remember a specific type of food. And it actually started to attract the youth back to villages, because now they had jobs and they could use the energy from the solar to generate this food commodity. It's a local delicacy that is very much in demand. And it really invigorated the whole local economic development. And, I can happy to send you the link to the project. And I think this was a really heartwarming story, because I think it was a reverse migration that also generated jobs, that provided job opportunities to youth, that added sort of value added to the community as a whole. So I think we don't have enough of these stories, but I do believe that as we think through the innovation, particularly of energy access, and I speak in Africa context, where half the people don't even have access to energy, that really curtails their job opportunities and sometimes preempts some of this migration to happen. Whereas I think we could convert that into that sort of productive, climate smart, green jobs. But I'm sure Viviane has others to add. But I just want to say thank you. Why I know the time is tight from my end, for your end.
Uh-huh.
No, thanks, Kanta. It's a nice example to end on. Adding my thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much. There were a couple of questions that we may have touched upon indirectly or not, but in any case, I will forward you the questions. I think it's always useful to have some feedback from the audience, and especially diverse audience that attends these. It's across. People from all expertise especially are interested in climate change and migration. And I think that this is very important to foster the collaboration, being able to hear from different voices, not talk to ministries of environment only. So I'm pretty sure that we will learn more from our audience questions. Thank you so much. This is a fascinating research. I believe the audience now know where to look for the full report. In any case, we posted the link, and we will still post it in the follow-up to this talk. I wish you all the best, and hopefully this week will bring only good news.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for reaching out to us.
Of course.
Thanks so very much.
Thank you, and thank you to all in audience for asking the questions and being with us for the past hour.
Yes, great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.